Our moderator for the panel discussion this evening, or this afternoon, is Mr. Brian Norman at the end, if you haven't met him. Brian is one of our treasures. He's a founding member of the PPOA NSW, and PPOA actually founded PACCOA. So PACCOA was born out of the New South Wales Association, the recognition that, you know, a national body to make sure that each state was engaged and heard was born. So Brian, I don't know what else much to say about you other than we love you dearly, and he's a regular at our events, and when in doubt we go to Brian as a compass, as a direction. I admire everything that he's achieved in his career, and that's a lot. And so I look forward to introducing Brian to moderate our discussion this afternoon. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Ingrid. You can do my eulogy. But not yet. But
not yet, Brian.
but not yet. Yes, not yet. We've had a great day today, and I was just thinking, this is not really 4:42 on Wednesday afternoon. Imagine it's 9:30 on Monday night, and you've just switched on to ABC for Q&A, and I'm Tony Jones.
Tony Jones.
Yeah. A great chance, really, it's just a chance for us to perhaps reflect on the wonderful presentations we've had today, the Babette's feast almost of information that we've shared today with these wonderful people who are sitting here with me today. And I saw that the topic for today was how do we negotiate the process demands of the role to provide evidence-based practice. Now, interpret that as you may, but I guess everybody in this room is well aware of the demands of the particular role that you're working in, and to some extent the discussions that we've had today have led to the talks about the possibilities and the constraints of working in the correctional field. So I just want to open this up to the panel and to the floor to, I guess, start teasing out some of the things that we feel we've pulled out of today so far, and some of the questions that we might have, and to see if we can take this and look at what opportunities there might be for perhaps a group such as PACCOA to advance the goals that we have. So does anybody from this august group of presenters want to put 2 shillings worth in for a start? David Daley's never short of a bit of change in his pocket.
I'd like to pick up on an issue which came up, I guess, in the wonderful drug court presentation. It's always been in my mind that there's 2 real problems about drug courts. One is that they won't work, but a much more serious problem is that they will. And if that doesn't make any sense at all, I recall that in Victoria there is only 1 drug court. Looks like there only ever will be one. So in a sense, what government did with much fanfare was it put itself out there and said, look, we're going to do this because we think this will achieve these things. And in due course it was evaluated, and lo and behold, it did achieve all those things. Now, government is in a very difficult position because the outlay on the cost of running the Dandenong Drug Court is quite substantial. It's been clear that government will never, or not likely to, duplicate that level of funding into other communities to provide that kind of service. So the question then is, with specialist courts, not necessarily only drug courts, the issue about, well, I guess the propriety or the morality or whatever you like to call it of creating reasonable community expectations, being able to deliver on those community expectations, but only to a very small sector of the community, and then leaving the rest of the community somewhat in limbo. And whether that's an issue for anyone else, it just seems to me in some other courts, specialist courts, seeing some kind of evidence of the same kind of thing. And I think there's also, in some jurisdictions now, there are a whole raft of specialist courts all doing good things in their own sector, but then you begin to wonder if maybe having specialist courts is compartmentalising people as problems. And I think some conversation around that might be interesting.
Well, so I think that the drug court issue is like the emperor has no clothes. First of all, in the U.S., they are, well evaluated, a lot of good data, just like you said, to support them. And yes, that less than 3% of the offender population in the community are involved in drug treatment courts or problem-solving courts. So the reach is very small. That's one issue. The second issue is it's been almost over 25 years that drug courts have been in existence, and they haven't changed the total practice of the legal system or the justice system. And to me, while I applaud all of the innovation and the teamwork and the ability to kind of try and deal with people's problems in different ways, if in 25 years you really can't change the face of justice, then you become continuously a subspecialty. And I think we have a problem in the justice system if we're going to just basically pull out a few people and hang that out there and say, hey, look, we're doing some really good stuff here. Okay, so that's all right for the first year or 2 or 3, but 25 years later, you can't just have these few cases and a few people in the system working on something. So I think part of, you raised the question, but I'd want to take it a little bit farther, which is if we're really interested in justice and we're really interested in resolving some of these community issues, why haven't something that seems to be very effective been contagious and changed practice in terms of how prosecutors, police officers, judges, probation and parole, treatment providers work. And I think that's kind of one of the more salient issues. And I would be not well received in the States because they're still very much perceived as being, what everyone thinks the system looks like, but it's such a small percentage.
So Liz, how would you mainstream, start mainstreaming that?
Thank you. I do feel compelled to respond, and I may take some hours if that's okay. There is a really big debate about mainstreaming this therapeutic jurisprudence and trying to apply these principles across other systems. There are so many points to make about this. While I accept everything that's been said and there are legitimate criticisms that have been made, I think there are valid responses that can also be made to them. Firstly, the legal system is inherently conservative and a very slow-moving beast, and so it does take a long time and a lot of energy and a lot of motivation to bring about change. And I would say, in response to the issue about the small percentage of offenders in the States, I think that the whole point is that we're dealing with the very high-end and very high-risk people, but we have already, I think it's something like 3,000 or 5,000 problem-solving courts, 3,000 drug courts in the States. So, well, I know...
Those are overstatement of numbers.
Is that right?
Yeah, there's only about 800 drug treatment courts.
Okay, so it's problem-solving courts.
Our data does not suggest that they are the high-risk, high-need population. And in fact, a major push right now is to get drug courts to take people with serious criminal histories.
Okay.
They've tended to take first-time offenders.
Oh, okay. So that's an issue. And of course, I should point out that I visited 17 jurisdictions around the world for a day each. So I'm not an expert on all of the issues. And clearly in Australia we've taken a different approach, or at least in Tasmania we have, in terms of looking to that high end. But what I would say about that is that even if we can make a difference at that high end, it makes a big difference in terms of future victims and in terms of reducing crime, because those people are committing such a lot of crime. So in terms of our own program, we aim for people who are committing a lot of property crime associated with drug use, and some of these guys admit to committing 30 or 40 burglaries a night in order to support their drug habit. So even if we can make a difference with one person and take that person out of the system for any length of time, that has to be a good thing. So another point to make is that we don't actually have any dedicated resources to this program in Tasmania. So we have federal government funding, we have no state government funding. So the way that it works in practice doesn't take a great burden of money out of the system. We have, in the south of the state, 4 magistrates who run a drug court list, which we call court-mandated diversion. Those magistrates just run that list as one of their lists. It's not a separate, we don't have a dedicated judge, we don't have a dedicated infrastructure. It's simply part of the ongoing role of the court to run these drug court lists fortnightly or however often it might be. So the resources that are going into that are not significant. I think that argument can run either way. I think if we put more resources in, we would get more of a response, and we can see that the results are good. So I think if we multiplied that, we would see an incremental response, but that hasn't been, we haven't got to that point yet, and I think we have a very slow and steady approach. Whereas I thought my impression from what I've heard from the judges I've spoken to in the States is that it has been quite infectious, but I accept that it is still a small proportion of offenders. And I guess my response to that would be if there was more funding that went into it, there could be more positive results that came out of it. So even though if it's not targeting high-end offenders, then that's a different issue, because certainly that's where the evidence seems to indicate that the courts are most effective. The other comment to make about mainstreaming generally is the comments that a number of judges have made that moving back out of a drug court into a mainstream jurisdiction has the effect of them actually changing their practice and taking a therapeutic approach that they've learnt in a problem-solving court back to a mainstream court. Now, that may bring about long-term change within the court system, but it's almost generational change. It's not something that's necessarily going to have an impact overnight. But we've seen that in Tasmania as well, where we've had, at one stage we had all our magistrates running a drug court list, and we've now cut that back to 4 in the south and 1 each in the north and the northwest. And we're still trying to cut that back further, because the evidence seems to indicate that dedicated judges are much more effective. But what's happened with the magistrates who've gone back to their mainstream practice is we've seen that they've taken a more therapeutic approach generally, and a more constructive sort of problem-solving, collaborative approach within the court system. The court system's a very difficult beast to change, and I guess this is not something we can hope is going to happen overnight. But I do think there's hope. I do think it's an area where in every part of the criminal justice system that I've seen over the past 24 years, this is where I've seen more enthusiasm and more passion and more energy and more hope than in any other. So of course it's important that we have the evidence and that we back up our practice with rigorous evidence, but I think it's a really powerful opportunity to be able to work in a way that inspires people to actually get involved and extend this movement, which seems to me to be just growing all around the world.
Thanks. Any more questions or comments on that? Thank you.
Excuse me.
And I think I could add to that, it's also in terms of how we measure effectiveness. I think that conversation was raised this morning. Reoffence isn't the be-all and end-all. Within the Aboriginal sex offender program, we almost had a celebration when one of our offenders only came back on a cannabis offence. He's gone from being a very serious sex offender to someone who has drug problems that we can then work with as well.
And of course, sometimes people have to, some offenders have to churn through the system a number of times before there's a gradual realisation, gradual building up of experience and skill and realisation before they do in fact desist. I was thinking though, Carolyn, with your experience in terms of the familiar side program, what sort of issues might there be for a group such as this to consider when they're faced with having an offender who's come under some form of supervision for a family violence related issue. What are the issues, particularly when we're actually talking about, in this program, working together? How do we actually get our people and the rest of the system working better to try to protect families, to help inoculate children against the effects of the abuse that's going on anyway, and make sure that people are protected?
Well, a couple of things that I've been thinking about while I've been here today. And the first thing is there's a lot of talk about justice, but actually there's another term that really underpins that for me, and that's social justice. And when it comes to violence, and the other area of my research, which I didn't talk about today, which is intimate partner homicide, that in Western Australia, those perpetrators are around 50% Indigenous, and they are 3% of our population in Western Australia. I'm not sure what the figures are over here. But you can see from that that these kinds of violent crimes emanate from much bigger issues than the domestic violence or the substance abuse that you might see in an individual perpetrator. And I know that you're all very aware of that. But I think one of the key things for me is, because I find it hard to even now think of myself as an academic. If you ask me what I am, I wouldn't say assistant professor, I'd probably say social worker. Is this link between research and practice. And I think that when I was in practice, I was often very, very busy, and I thought I was too busy to keep up with the latest literature and so on. But now I'm in academia and I look back on that time, I wish I had. And I wish that in those days the departments that I worked for had better links with the academic institutions, so that there would have been more opportunities to work in partnership. Because I think if that had been the case, our practice would have been better, and perhaps the research might have been better as well. So I'd encourage you as practitioners not to lose sight of your professionalism, and not to get ground down by the relentless workload that I know you all endure, but to fight for time in your busy week and busy day to keep up with the literature so that you're aware. And secondly, to think about particularly risk assessment, because what I was talking about today about some of these offenders who offend within the family might be a little bit different from the generalist violent offender, in as much as, yes, they may have had a long history of domestic violence. Some of that may not have come out. Some of them may not have a criminal record. But the fact is that according to the context, including the time, they can become extremely dangerous. And so when you're looking at risk assessment, to think about some of the things that I was talking to Doug about earlier, and that is that they're dynamic, and risk assessment has to be ongoing when you're working with people who are potentially violent. You can't just do a risk assessment, say, at a very early stage of their involvement with the criminal justice system. They need to be ongoing. So I guess that's a very long answer. I'm not sure if I answered everything you asked, but I'm willing to respond to any questions.
Anybody else want to comment about that or ask a question on that subject? Reese.
Hi, Carolyn. Yeah, I was just wanted to know, like, going on from that and what you spoke about, whether you think that domestic abuse is taken as seriously as it should be, both from a community perspective and from a justice perspective. In particular, you spoke before during your presentation that often the perpetrators of these, offences come from generally what would appear to be stable backgrounds previously, being the fact they're working in white-collar jobs, probably skilled, unlikely to have accommodation issues, unlikely to have social issues. I guess the difficulty, and whether we can shed light on it, I don't know, is how do we, or where can we work to pick that up on earlier in the stage? And then on the flip side, playing devil's advocate, working with risk need responsivity, given these people are going to often, score low on our risk assessment. So particularly if you get someone under supervision on a bond for a breach of AVO, and I don't speak for all jurisdictions, but I know in my experience in case management, often, breaching an AVO, like you said, is a slap on the wrist. How do we pick up upon that in terms of risk for the future, or where can we, work better if we can?
Thank you. That's a very good question. I think what we can do is to focus assessment on the psychodynamic characteristics of the offender. So maybe not so much the history of violence, particularly outside of the family, because there might not be much of a history, although some of my research indicated that there had been other violent incidents within the family or friendship group. So it's more like looking at how does the person cope with emotional abandonment? How do they respond when they feel rejected? Do they see themselves as a fully functioning person when they're outside of an intimate relationship? How well do they cope with those? So that the assessment would incorporate those factors rather than some of perhaps just the normal measures that you might consider when you're doing that kind of assessment.
Actually, the same's not so different for the sex offender field. Many of the men that we had that come to the program have offended over a long time, but if you measure them on something like the static 99, because they're older, because they only have cluster offences, they're going to score as low risk. But when you look at the dynamic factors, that will take them up to a high risk. So that way you can manage the political authorities of working with a low risk offender, which we generally aren't supposed to do, or at least in my department. So it's a similar thing for both fields.
So to add to that, under the R&R supervision model, the trigger analysis piece, which was, one of the big components, is really designed to really help the probationer or the person understand what those dynamic factors are. And I think this is the difference between public safety and public health, in the sense that, it's probably not in the best interest to extend the penalties of people, in the system. But it is in the best interest of using the time that we have with someone in the system and helping them to understand the issues that are going to continually be in their kind of a revolving door issue. And I think that's one of the difficulties a lot of probation officers have, is seeing that they have a preventative role, really, in really dealing with some of these factors that may not necessarily be within the confines of what's the current issues are. But when you see a pattern with a person, the most important part is helping them understand the pattern and the resources in the community, so that, when supervision ends, they potentially have, the ability to go and try and continue those resources.
I agree with what Faye's just said. Certainly when I was working on the sex offender program in Perth, we were working with people in those days to look at their offending cycle and what were the likely triggers and what were the things that they would put in place, what cognitive distortions and apparently irrelevant decisions that they might introduce to justify or rationalise their behaviour to themselves. But I think the other thing that's really important for people such as yourselves is to actually take on an educative role, not just with your clients and colleagues, but also in the wider society. And I remember when I first began researching familicide, some of the, as I mentioned this morning, some of the media coverage of those offences was very ill-informed. And the university where I work organised a media conference where they invited the editors of the major newspapers and television news programs, but also invited the junior reporters along to a breakfast. And at that breakfast, I presented my research. Police officers who'd been involved in familicide cases came and spoke to the media people, and also victims of familicide or survivors of familicide spoke as well. And what we noticed in Western Australia after that was that cases were reported somewhat differently. You still get the odd one. But I think that the general community out there is very ignorant about the social justice issues that relate to all offenders. And I think part of our role, because we do know this, is to actually communicate it and to try and find a way to communicate it. And perhaps one of the ways we could work together, I mean, between academic people and practitioners, is to work on projects, even research projects together, where those results get published in a way that community corrections is part of that process. I just think it's really important, because I think you guys do such amazing, important work, and a lot of the time it's a very thankless task. And the knowledge you have would benefit the wider community in the way they perceive offenders. And I think it's much needed in Australia.
Can I just add that some years ago we called on a group, a fourth-year group, I think, of final-year students from Monash University Communications School to, in fact, do some research for us on public perceptions of community corrections and whether it added value. And the first thing they found is, of course, they put theoretical scenarios. What would you do if an offender did this, this, or this in these circumstances? I would do this, this, and this. And then they changed the scenarios or give them a bit more information. This is, you know, it's a common enough technique. But went on from that to say, well, okay, once you start to understand a bit about the dynamics and the landscape of what community corrections does, is it a useful thing to do? Well, yes, it is. Does it add great value to the community? Yes, it does. And then the cruncher, how do we market that? And the answer from nearly everyone was, don't bother. It's like knowing that morticians do their job when they're necessary, and we respect that. But we don't really want to know on a day-by-day basis. And when put up against Dancing with the Stars or Australia's Got Talent, this just doesn't rate. So look, we're pleased that you do what we do. We would like you to continue to do what we do, but we really don't want to know about the detail. Now, there are a lot of smarter people, and I am out there, I'm sure, and some of you might like to turn your attention to that, because the only research, and sadly I never ever put it together and published it, but what it said was, you can change people's perceptions about what you do and the value of what you do, but whether it's a marketable package or how you go about that, that eluded me at the time, and there's got to be some answers in there which we just haven't yet penetrated.
Well, now you've got so much extra time on your hands.
Stuart's wanted to say something. Yeah.
Thanks. David doesn't know it, but he just segued straight into my question about how do we market it. Well, somebody is marketing it, because you touched on it during your presentation about privatisation. So someone does see the value in what we do. And as soon as I hear the word privatisation around anything to do with the justice area, corrections, community corrections, there's one word that comes to mind, Serco. Because now that's a company that's already got the English corrections. You see their names on all the trucks and everything. Now that's a company that sees value, obviously, in what we do, and they've got tentacles. They're a global organisation. They've got tentacles in every government on this planet. You know, they're represented on every defence base on Australian soil in some form or another, in security, in housekeeping, in something like that. Has there ever been a study relating to how much money that the governments are paying organisations such as Serco, and in relation to what we do?
But But one of the things which is, we had a conversation, a few of us at lunchtime, about privatisation and the benefits, alleged benefits, which are in terms of things like benchmarking value, in terms of ensuring competition, best price for purchasing value for government, and all those other wonderful things. They're the things that help privatisation market itself. Where the problem lies, of course, is that what we most often don't know is that privatisation can be argued, and this is a personal view, but I think there's some evidence for this, that in fact it doesn't actually increase public accountability and transparency. It actually diminishes it, for the simple reason that now nearly everything you want to know and need to know is hidden under the mask of commercial and confidence. So it's going to be, I would say, in Victoria now, look, it's just probably not worth asking anymore because it's almost impossible. Routine data, which is non-controversial, which was published year on year on year, and Naomi would know this as well, suddenly isn't on the newsstands anymore. It isn't on the government websites, and it's not even bad news stuff. It's just stuff that somebody might choose to analyse, and that might lead to some awkward questions. And so I think it's interesting that privatisation has been packaged and sold along with things like transparency, accountability, better value for money, and so far seems to have been either bought or people are reserving judgment, when in actual fact there's some very serious questions about the fact that we may never know what some of that actually means.
Yeah, just because anyone that works, especially at one of the New South Wales jails that's privatised, is trying to get information in and out, trying to get access to do the job and things like that. It's quite difficult, and we were talking about this because the location where I work is one of the trials now for this new bias program, which is going to be value-added case management. And when we sort of read through what it is, well, you're doing the job, you're doing 101 probation and parole officer work, which is connecting people to services. You know, and they come in with this guise of we're going to specialise in accommodation and things like that. You know, and the question is, well, there's already an agency down the road with a big sign out the front that says Housing New South Wales. You know, so how's someone else, an NGO, going to get that process happening any quicker?
We're stuck to some degree, I think, with a 1960s, 1950s view of public sector, which has long since ceased to be real. So the view that the public sector provided you a lifelong sinecure, the job was secure, you wouldn't be fired, and therefore you didn't need to do very much, and public servants were classically either indolent or they were adverse to change, averse to anything that upset the comfort that they'd become accustomed to. I mean, that world has long since gone, but I think in the public mind there's still strong residues of the fact that if we can move it into the private sector, that's got to be better, it's got to be leaner, it's got to be quicker, it's got to be more effective, it's got to be more efficient. And I think that's where we have to attack the problem, because the public sector against which public mind often compares these things is no longer, and hasn't been for generations, the public sector that I know and that you know.
I can sort of shift a little bit away from that, but it is partially in response to that issue. I think there are a number of things that we can do that we haven't really done within the sector before to tackle these sorts of concerns. One of the problems that we have in government is that we're so hampered by our inability to speak out. And I think there are ways around that I'm starting to think about these days that I haven't really had to think about in the past. And one of them was a conversation that I just had with Yolanda from New South Wales before I came up here. The social media platform, which hasn't really been... I'm actually too old for social media. It's not my cup of tea at all, but it's such a powerful medium, and it's a means to get a message out in ways that we haven't really thought about in the past. Now, speaking from my experience, our department is so risk-averse and so fearful when it comes to any engagement in the media. Their response to that is just simply to not engage. Whether we can get around that in using social media remains to be seen, but I think there's definitely scope for that. Another way that we're trying to divert the story, I suppose, to get the good story out, to get out what we want to be saying, is through the sort of groups that was mentioned in one of the presentations today, the collective. So bringing together a coalition of stakeholders in, for example, if I take the drug court example, New Zealand does this particularly well. They have an action coalition for their drug courts, and that group's made up of community-based stakeholders, service providers, universities who are involved in evaluation. All of the relevant players come together under an umbrella of the Drug Court Action Coalition or whatever they're called, and that group has the capacity to speak out in a public forum in a way that the department may not or wouldn't even if it did. So that's another means to sort of subvert the inability to have this voice heard. And the other one that we've talked about already is the universities, that if we have close collaboration with the universities have the capacity to be the voice that we in the sector possibly can't be. And I mean, I know these are really serious, difficult problems, but I hope they're not insurmountable, and I hope we can sort of find ways around them, even if we have to be a little bit... We have to think creatively. We have to have a different approach to what we've had in the past. But it seems to me that there are possibilities that we haven't really taken on board yet.
And I suspect that tiny group that we are, and well down the food chain that we are a collective voice for people who work in this particular area, and we are a body that can actually speak up in ways that perhaps administrators are unable to do, and sometimes might be grateful if we did do, because we can actually work outside the square, and we can build the sorts of partnerships that and have in the past and are doing in different ways, but we can continue to go down that track and actually start to put it out there rather than so that we're no longer just being reactive, or our masters are reactive. We can actually give them something positive to work to. So I think, yeah, there's lots of positive opportunities there, as well as lots of pitfalls. Anybody else?
Just another really brief comment, and then I'll be quiet, I promise. We have a lawyer in the south of Tasmania who's a really strong advocate for the criminal justice client. He's the only one, really, and he has a view that we should leave it to the experts, and that, for example, in the health field, we don't have every member of the public having an opinion on whether the health department should spend money on the machine that goes ping. We leave it to the experts, and his view is that in criminal justice, why is it that we don't trust the experts to make the decisions? Why is it that every member of the community somehow feels that they have a much greater stake in criminal justice policy making than they do, for example, in health policy making? And at the same time, I accept that people do feel that they have a stake in criminal justice, because many people will have a connection with a victim or with an offender or some sort of experience of their own. But there is also an argument that perhaps PACCOA could be strong in pushing, which is the experts are there, the evidence is in, people are doing the job, let's let them get on and do the job. And maybe that's a message that PACCOA could be promoting.
Oh, I think it's my turn. Okay. Great discussion. Do you mind if I change tack just a little bit? Because when I looked at the theme for this afternoon, what came to mind for me was a long, long time ago when I was a CCO myself. And with all the CCOs that I train these days, what I hear about consistently, and you raised it, Carolyn, was a whole lot of work pressure, high caseloads, no time to keep abreast with the evidence-based practice, the research, what works, what's coming out, what's new, and how we can change our practice on an ongoing basis. And I've often thought about this very issue. How do we, as researchers, policy consultants and academics, best get that information to the people at the coalface who are doing the work on a daily basis? Because this, attending a conference, really is a privilege. And when you look at the numbers here and how well we represent all the CCOs in this country, we probably wouldn't even make up 1%, I'm not entirely sure. But how do we get the message out there to them? And so my question is not just to the panel, but to the audience, who are the CCOs. How do you want to receive updates and information? And maybe the PACCOA streaming is a great strategy. I've often thought about, could we do lunchtime talks? But then there's so many different CCO offices. Which one would I go to? These are my questions. How do we share the information? How do they want to receive it?
Great.
I was going to say, I love email newsletters, so quite often I'll sign up to them. So they're automatically distributed into my account, so whether it's a weekly or a monthly newsletter. So PACCOA could do that. As a new piece of research comes available, just forward that link or anything to all the members, and then they have the opportunity to read, to store, to delete, however they see fit. And then, you know, quite often when I get material in my office, the first thing I do is I read it and I analyse it for information, and then I try and determine, is that going to be beneficial for other staff that I work with? Can I distribute that to them? Can I talk about it at case management meetings, staff meetings? You know, what can we do to stimulate conversation and discussion and perhaps growth in our professional development?
You can like us on Facebook. Yes. Beware, there are 2 PACCOA Facebooks, Yolanda.
The thing I find valuable and perhaps would reach a broader audience is if we can implement like a webinar kind of strategy where it's an interactive webinar, specific time, specific place, as part of, you know, training and development day or afternoon or evening. You know, most people are available during the evening or perhaps early morning when nothing else is happening. Well, you want to dream, you know, go to sleep maybe. But that's sort of, because you know, I'm studying at the moment distance education, and webinars are a valuable tool for me. I'm a working single mother and studying full-time on a master's and in life coaching. So, you know, the interaction is very big for me because I can't be in the classroom, and that's my style of learning, is being in the classroom. So something like this, you know, could be an interactive webinar, you know, streamed through to district offices. It's just, you know, as part of a conference network, you're on your laptop or on your computer, and it's, you know, an hour, you know, on one particular topic, you know, domestic violence, sex offenders, you know, that sort of thing. So, yeah, something to think about.
Just on the new website on PACCOA, there is a forum for members only, and we've built that forum especially to encourage members to engage within that, and that's our hope, that we can get people from a national basis to engage in that forum and talk about specific things that they're involved in.
Absolutely. So we need executive members for PACCOA. We need dedicated executive members if it's coming through PACCOA. So get amongst it.
Another idea, use your universities. If you have a particular client and you're not sure what to do, ask the experts. They're a lot more accessible than you think.
Go.
Sorry. Oh, thank you. I just wanted to say how impressed I am when a political issue comes up relating to medical services, how the AMA gets up and basically puts the opinion of their members to the public. What happens if there's an outbreak from a prison, or a sex offender commits another offence just after being released on parole, is you probably get a comment from the minister that's very political, very brief, and designed to calm feelings. But it would be really interesting, I think, to add to that by having a statement from a body such as PACCOA when these things happen, that's well informed, based on good evidence, and has some kind of professionalism around it, that would have an educative function in the community.
So I was going to comment that in terms of the education of your membership and keeping up, and I'm a little too old for all of these things too, but I learned from my students that YouTube and being able to post, you know, and this is something your association may want to even consider, 5 to 10 minute talks instead of an hour talk, people can actually use those easier, and it forces the presenter to get to the point. So, you know, it's not like me who strung together a whole bunch of different themes today. It'd be one theme for a short period of time, kind of to the point. The other thing that I would encourage you to do is in your staff meetings is to bring those types of short materials to your team to really go through and talk about the implications either for your office or caseload or things of that nature. But I have a really good colleague, and she sort of has she has something that she calls her professional book club, where she has challenges all the supervisors in her organization to identify either one book or one short reading that everybody should read, and they take it on for like 2 months at a time, and it becomes the topic of conversation, and it's really used to educate the organization around one particular area, and that's something that you all could do easily.
I could add to that, Faye. Thank you. Another idea that I just had is, because it's so hard when you're out in the field keeping up with all the different research papers that get published, if a body like PACCOA or a group of interested people were to find papers that were a meta-analysis of the research in a particular area that interested you people, and then what they did was simply circulate or inform you about the meta-analysis, or even building on the person who was talking about a newsletter, actually took the meta-analysis and pulled the guts out of that and put that in your newsletter, so that busy people didn't have to read the whole lot. They could just get the really important thrust of it.
Thanks. Some years ago, PACCOA and the Australian Institute of Criminology worked with some of the community corrections administrators. I think you might have been. Were you doing that at the time, David? And we had a round table in Canberra, and with support from the Federal Justice Ministry, who were prepared to pay for it, we proposed the establishment of a national research agenda into the management of community-based offenders, and put it to the correctional administrators, and they said no. In fact, we did it on two occasions at their annual gathering, and on each occasion they said no. Was never absolutely clear why, because they never published their reasons, but as far as I could establish from my sources at the time, there were a group of administrators who could get all the money they wanted to build their jails and run their jails and increase their prison populations, and they didn't need to have any evidence to do that. So there was a distinct desire not to be to put their heads up above the trenches there and to be told what they should do, and certainly by the feds, because there was in our system here in Australia, it's very much a jurisdiction-based thing. But it's not to say that somewhere or other we can't resurrect at least that notion somewhere along the way in building networks with universities around the place, and starting to build those connections and get that information out through our channels and various channels.
It might be, it might be a good chance to get that moving again. Look, I wasn't at the table at Canberra, but I know what happened. I know very well what happened. And what happened was petty politics came into play, and there were personality forces as between administrators of two of the largest states and administrators within the AIC, and those personality conflicts were then used to kibosh something which was an absolutely winner of an idea. The other thing was petty-mindedness. Somebody who was an administrator at that time said, that this would not proceed because there was no national dedicated prison research agenda, therefore there ought not to be one for community corrections, which after all was the minor player in all of this. Now, the question, of course, about should starving men be denied half a loaf of bread when a whole loaf of bread's not available? Should we not do something? It's a drop in the bucket, but which would you rather have, drops going into a bucket or an empty bucket? And so I think, look, the dynamics, I'm out of it now, so I can't tell you what the personal dynamics are, but I think the organisational dynamics are much more settled than they used to be. And I certainly would encourage you to have a go at it again, because it would be a great thing. There's a national repository of expertise and excellence there, and it really, it's also looking around, as far as I know, for ways to make itself more relevant and more meaningful and to give itself a bigger voice. So it'd be a great thing to capitalise on that.
Probably on that very positive note, it's exactly 4:30 and time for us to go, unless somebody has a burning, absolutely burning question that they have been wanting to put all afternoon. No? We're all done. Can I ask you to put your hands together and thank our wonderful presenters and wonderful panel. And we'll see you all again next Monday night at 9:30.